Hello everyone. In this short presentation I will discuss a few needs and challenges that we should address to achieve a more effective disaster risk management practice for cultural heritage. Currently, we see that many national and international institutions are expressing concerns about disaster risk reduction for cultural heritage. Likewise, existing frameworks for disaster risk reduction also emphasize the need to develop and implement measures to reduce risk to cultural heritage in their objectives. As an example, it can be seen that the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction makes explicit reference to cultural heritage in its four main priorities, particularly in priority 3. To achieve an efficient risk management practice in cultural heritage, but also in any other sector, it is fundamental to adequately implement the risk management cycle, which is part of the disaster management cycle. The risk management cycle involves 5 main stages, which are the risk assessment stage, that establishes the risk to the asset under assessment, the risk communication stage that delivers the risk assessment output in an adequate format to the decision makers, the analysis and decision making stage where decision makers will decide what to do, the risk mitigation and treatment stage where risk reduction measures are implemented, and the control and monitoring stage where the asset situation is monitored. After a while, the process needs to be repeated because risk changes over time. However, to achieve an adequate implementation of the risk management cycle, several challenges need to be addressed, and some of these challenges can be expressed using the following 3 questions which will be addressed during this presentation. Do we know what cultural heritage we are losing to disasters? Do we know and understand the risks cultural heritage is exposed to? And do we know enough about our cultural heritage? Regarding the first question, we know that some information can be obtained by searching online news sources, for example. However, getting detailed and reliable data on the impacts that a given disaster had on the cultural heritage sector is usually a difficult task. What we see is that, currently, there is no systematic collection of cultural heritage damage and loss data caused by worldwide hazardous events. Also, disaster-related data is scattered among various agencies without any coherence or coordination. And there are no standardized methods and tools for disaster data collection. To address some of these issues, we have been developing an online database to record disaster loss data from cultural heritage. This database, called DALI, which stands for Damage and Loss Inventory for Heritage, was developed in the context of the project REACT, Risk Indicators for the Analysis of Cultural Heritage Under Threat. The database is currently in the testing stage and will provide a framework to collect data on different types of disaster impacts to cultural heritage, giving access to this data. This database can be integrated with the risk management cycle, and one of its objectives is to provide data that will support different stages of the risk management cycle, namely by providing empirical data that may validate some of the analyses that are carried out. Regarding the second question, it is important to first understand our starting point, namely the fact that cultural heritage assets are usually unique, complex, and multidimensional in value. Detailed risk assessment methods are usually difficult to apply to cultural heritage, basically because we are usually faced with complex and unknown physical behavior. We have also lots of difficulties in getting reliable data on their engineering properties. Also, there is too much cultural heritage at risk. We need to perform the risk assessment of many cultural heritage assets for many hazards, and available resources are usually low. We are low on time and money. And finally, risk assessments need to be regularly updated because risk changes over time. All of this means that we need specific approaches for risk assessment in cultural heritage. Another important aspect to acknowledge is the fact that the risk assessment approach that is selected depends on the scale and the objectives of the risk management process for which the assessment is performed and on the type of heritage under analysis. When we speak about the scale, we mean that we could analyze the risk for only one asset or a group of assets, either movable or immovable. On the objectives, we need to understand if we are analyzing, let's say, the risk to define policies and strategies for risk mitigation, or to define measures to reduce the potential damages and losses, or to monitor the evolution of the potential damages and losses. And finally, when we speak about type of heritage, again, we are here in the realm of immovable heritage, built or natural, movable heritage, or even intangible heritage, or everything together, of course. For the particular case of built heritage, given its large variety and the multiple objectives that may be considered, a 2-stage approach is proposed. The first stage involves the use of simplified methods that are applied to a large group of heritage assets to establish a ranking that will identify assets that are okay and assets that are requiring a more detailed analysis to get a full picture of their risk. In the second stage, the analyses are then now more detailed, but only apply to the assets that are clearly at risk, in order to determine risk reduction measures, or for which there are doubts. In the context of Stage 1 methodologies, we have also been developing several approaches for flood, risk, and earthquake risk assessment for different types of heritage within the REACT project. Finally, regarding the third question, we know that risk management requires information about cultural heritage that can be roughly divided into two components. A first component for characterizing the physical vulnerability of the assets, which involves technical drawings and photo-video surveys, material properties, etc. And a second component for characterizing the values that are exposed to risks, which involve information about the values and significance of the assets at the local, regional, national, or even international levels, the type of activities associated with the assets, their economic revenues, etc. Regarding the first component, we know that cultural heritage is repeatedly surveyed for multiple purposes, but the information is not collected and stored in ways that make it accessible and needs to change. Regarding the second component, this information is critical since it can provide estimates of the expected losses in a disaster when it is combined with information on vulnerability. These expected losses need to be able to represent the holistic and time-distributed impact of cultural heritage in societies, and need to be established in a clear and objective way so that stakeholders can understand these impacts and compare them with those of other sectors. The main issue is that most direct losses are likely to be intangible, and only some of the indirect losses may be quantified. And to characterize the expected indirect losses, we will need to correlate the expected physical damage of heritage assets with the economic value of the expected changes in the flow of goods and services, and with expected macroeconomic impacts and human development impacts across different sectors. And for that, additional research and data collection are needed. But these estimates could be supported by information collected from past disasters, as we said before. So just to wrap up, we have seen that the implementation of effective actions for disaster risk management in cultural heritage needs further discussion and developments. Some of the issues that were discussed highlight the need for better disaster loss data collection, more adequate and tailored risk assessment approaches, more efficient data management practices, and specific methods to quantify expected disaster losses. Some of the ongoing and needed developments on this issue were also briefly discussed. Thank you very much for your attention.